The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, but by the time I was done reading it, everything had changed. Violation of property rights, it said. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in a fine and possible legal action. My eyes skimmed over the words again, trying to make sense of them. The HOA claimed that my private lake, the one I'd spent years cherishing as my personal sanctuary, was not private at all. They said it was a public resource, open for anyone to use. Anyone. I stood frozen in disbelief. How could they claim that? This lake was not just some body of water. It was the centerpiece of our property, the thing that had sold me on this land in the first place. It was where my family had spent countless weekends fishing, swimming, and enjoying the peace we had worked so hard for. The thought of anyone, and I mean anyone, just showing up and using it without permission was infuriating. Emily, my wife, came into the room just as I was gripping the letter, trying to process what it meant. She had a look of concern on her face as she saw the papers in my hands. "What's going on?" she asked softly, already sensing the tension. I handed her the letter without a word. Her face went pale as she read through the HOA's demands. "This can't be real," she muttered. "We've been living here for years. This is our land. How can they just take it away from us like that?" But the truth was, the HOA had never really respected our boundaries. Over the years, we had endured their constant meddling. Complaints about our garden, our driveway, even our fence. But this was different. This was personal. They weren't just interfering with our property. They were claiming control over something that was supposed to be ours, something that had no place in their regulations. A private lake. A lake that was supposed to be a refuge. Now, they wanted it as a public swimming hole. A place where anyone could show up, without notice, without respect. As the anger built inside me, I could feel the weight of the decision ahead. This wasn't just about a dispute with the HOA. This was about protecting my family's dream, about defending what was ours. But I wasn't going to let them walk over us. If the HOA thought they could dictate what we did with our property, they had another thing coming. I stood up, crumpling the letter in my hand. "We're not giving in," I told Emily. "It's time to make a stand. If they think they can claim our lake, they've got another thing coming." The moment I set foot outside, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. The letter was one thing, but I could already feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The HOA wasn't going to back down without a fight. They had their eyes set on something they thought they could control, and they had no idea who they were messing with. I marched straight to the lake, the water shimmering under the morning sun. The sight of it brought a wave of calm over me, but that calm quickly faded as I thought about the HOA's demands. The whole thing was insane. Public access? How could they even think they could turn our private lake into a public space? I wasn't going to let that happen. I refused to let that happen. Emily followed me down to the shore, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice wavering just slightly. "We're putting a stop to this right now," I said, the determination in my voice surprising even me. "I'm going to make sure they know exactly who owns this property." I spent the rest of the day planning. I didn't just want to fight back. I wanted to hit them where it hurt. I wanted to make a statement that would leave no doubt in anyone's mind. This land and that lake was ours. No one, not the HOA, not even the law, could just take it away. It was our property, and it was time to defend it like we meant it. The next morning, I started getting to work. I had a plan in mind, something bold, something that would make the HOA think twice before challenging me again. I wasn't going to quietly fill out forms or get caught up in some bureaucratic mess. No, I needed action, and I needed it fast. I drove to the hardware store and loaded up on everything I'd need: wood, nails, concrete, and fencing materials. I wasn't just building a fence. I was building a barrier. A physical statement that would show the HOA just how serious I was about keeping my lake to myself. By noon, I was out by the water, marking out the perimeter. Emily had her doubts, but I could see the spark of determination in her eyes. She knew this was our chance to finally take control. I'd seen that same spark when we first moved here, when we had talked about this being our sanctuary. Now, it was time to protect it. As I hammered in the first post, I could already hear the neighbors' whispers. The houses around our property weren't exactly close, But the small community was tight-knit. I could feel their eyes on me as I worked, some curious, some judging, but none of that mattered. This was about us standing our ground. By the time the sun began to set, the fence was half up. It wasn't just a fence. It was a wall of defiance, a way of saying no, you cannot come here. I felt a rush of pride as I stepped back and looked at the progress. But just as I was about to call it a day, I noticed something. A car had pulled up near the edge of our property, and I saw the familiar figure of Ted, the HOA president. He had come to inspect. I could see the irritation on his face as he got out of the car and walked toward me, clipboard in hand. "Well, well," Ted called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like someone is getting a little territorial. This lake isn't exactly private, is it?" I didn't even look up as I continued hammering in the fence post. "It is now," I said, my voice calm but resolute, "and I'm going to make sure it stays that way." Ted didn't respond immediately. He just stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of the fence. Then, with a huff, he began walking toward the lake. "I'm going to have to take this up with the board," Ted said, his tone growing more serious. "You can't just decide to fence in public property." "Take it up with whoever you want," I replied, finally turning to face him. "But this land is mine, and that lake is mine. No one is going to use it without my permission. Not you, not the HOA, and certainly not anyone else." Ted's face reddened. I could see the fury building behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by someone like me. But I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything we had been through to get to this point. "I'll make sure you regret this," he muttered under his breath, turning to leave. But before he got in his car, he shot me one last look. "This isn't over." "Good," I said, watching him drive off. "It's not over until I say it is." The following days were a blur of activity. As the fence began to take shape, so did the whispers around the neighborhood. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was focused on finishing what I started, making sure that the lake remained ours and ours alone. But soon, the whispers grew louder. My phone started buzzing constantly, with messages from neighbors, people I barely knew, all telling me about the complaints piling up. It wasn't just Ted from the HOA anymore. Suddenly, everyone seemed to have something to say. One neighbor, Greg, stopped by one afternoon while I was working on the fence. He'd been friendly at first when we moved in, but there was something about the way he approached me now that didn't sit right. His hands were in his pockets, a nervous energy hanging between us as he tried to make small talk. "You know," Greg said, his voice carefully neutral, "I heard some people from the HOA are pretty upset about the lake." He paused, clearly waiting for my reaction. "And what do you think?" I asked, not bothering to look up from my work. The hammer in my hand felt heavier with each swing, the stakes rising higher. "I just think," Greg started, his tone shifting, "that it's not really your decision to make. People have been using that lake for years. It's kind of a community thing." I stopped hammering and looked up at him for the first time. There was something condescending in his voice that made my blood boil. "Greg, this isn't a community lake. It's mine, and I don't need anyone telling me what I can do with my property." His eyes flickered to the growing fence, then back at me. "Well, you know, the HOA has rules, right?" He gave a small, almost apologetic shrug, but it didn't fool me. He wasn't here to offer advice. He was here to stir the pot. "I don't care about their rules," I said, my voice steady but with an edge. "This is my property, and I'll do what I want with it. If they don't like it, they can take me to court." Greg seemed to hesitate, his face tightening with unease. "Just be careful," he muttered, backing away. "You don't want to make them too angry." "Don't worry," I said. "I'm not the one starting trouble here." As soon as he left, I took a moment to breathe, shaking off the tension that had been building. But I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. Ted and the HOA were pushing harder now. The more I stood my ground, the more they were going to come at me. And I was ready for it. I didn't back down from challenges, and I certainly wasn't going to start now. I had a plan. One that would ensure the lake remained private, and more importantly, show the HOA that they couldn't just trample over people who fought for their rights. The next week, I received a formal notice from the HOA. This time, they were threatening legal action. The letter was clear. You are in direct violation of HOA policies regarding property use, and your recent fencing project is an illegal obstruction. If you do not dismantle the fence and allow public access to the lake, we will pursue further legal action. Reading the letter, I felt a surge of adrenaline. Legal action? They thought that was going to scare me? I dealt with bureaucrats and red tape before, but they had no idea who they were messing with. I wasn't about to let them dictate my life. I immediately called Emily. Her voice was calm but worried when she answered. "What now?" she asked. "We don't back down," I said, a fire in my gut. "I'm getting a lawyer." That night, I contacted the best attorney I knew. A no-nonsense, sharp woman named Linda who had a reputation for winning impossible cases. I explained everything. The lake, the HOA's actions, the ridiculous claims they were making about it being public land. Linda didn't waste a second. "Get me all your property documents and any photos of the land," she said, already making notes. "We'll counteract this. If they want to fight, they're going to get one." The next few days were a whirlwind. Linda sent out legal letters, demanding that the HOA cease and desist with their harassment. But the HOA didn't stop. In fact, their pressure only intensified. I could feel their eyes on me, watching my every move, waiting for me to slip up. They weren't going to let this go without a fight. Then, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while I was down by the lake, putting up the final section of the fence, I saw Ted again. This time, he wasn't alone. He had two other people with him, both dressed in business suits, carrying clipboards. I knew right away they were lawyers. The HOA was taking this to the next level. "Looks like we're at a crossroads," Ted said, his voice colder than ever. "We need to settle this now, or things are going to get much uglier." I didn't flinch. "There's nothing to settle," I said. "This is my property, and I'm not letting anyone, especially not you, decide how I use it." The tension in the air was palpable. They were circling, like wolves ready to strike. But I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. I wasn't going to be bullied out of what was rightfully mine. The lake was ours, and I was going to make sure it stayed that way, no matter what it took. The next week felt like a pressure cooker, the heat steadily rising with every passing day. The HOA wasn't backing off, and neither was I. Ted's visit with his lawyer friends had left a bad taste in my mouth, but I refused to let them intimidate me. They thought they could control me with their threats? Not a chance. I kept busy with the fence, adding more posts and strengthening the barriers. Emily helped whenever she could, though I could see the worry etched on her face. The constant tension was wearing us both down, but there was no way I could stop now. I knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about making a stand, showing that no one, not the HOA, not the law, could just take away what we had worked so hard to build. By the time the fence was complete, it stood tall and proud, a testament to our determination. The once tranquil lake was now completely enclosed, with a sturdy wooden barrier surrounding it. I felt a sense of pride in what we had done, but I also knew that the real battle was just beginning. The HOA wasn't going to let this slide. They were going to come after us with everything they had, and I had to be ready for it. One afternoon, just as I was finishing up the last section of the fence, I saw a car pull up. It was Ted again, but this time, he had a police officer with him. The officer stepped out of the car and gave me a stern look as Ted approached. I was immediately on alert. This was it. The moment I had been dreading had finally arrived. "Mr. Martin," the officer said, his tone official. "We've received several complaints about the fence you've built around the lake. The HOA is claiming it's an illegal obstruction, and they've requested that we issue a citation." I stood tall, my voice calm but unwavering. "This is my property, and I'm within my rights to build whatever I see fit on it." The officer frowned, glancing at Ted, who was standing nearby with a smug look on his face. "The problem is, Mr. Martin," the officer said, "that the lake is listed as a public resource, and your fence is preventing access to it." "Incorrect," I shot back, pointing to the documents in my hand. "This lake is private, and I have the papers to prove it. It's not a public resource, and I'm well within my rights to keep people out." Ted opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off before he could speak. "You don't get to make that call." "I do." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He had been sent by the HOA, but he didn't seem fully convinced by their case. He turned to Ted, who was now visibly frustrated. "Sir, I can't issue a citation unless there's clear evidence of a violation," the officer said, looking back at me. Ted clenched his fists, but he wasn't done. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll just take this to court." I nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle over me. "Take it to court," I said. "I'm not afraid of a fight." With that, Ted and the officer walked away, leaving me standing by the lake. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I had a feeling it was going to get much worse before it got better. The following days were filled with tension. The HOA kept up the pressure, filing complaints and even contacting the local government to try and force my hand. I didn't back down. I refused to let them push me into a corner. But I knew that the legal battle was coming, and it wasn't going to be easy. I called Linda, my lawyer, to prepare for what was next. She was as confident as ever. "We've got everything we need to win this," she assured me. "We'll present the documentation proving the lake is private property, and we'll show that the HOA's claims are baseless. They're just trying to intimidate you." But even as Linda spoke with conviction, I could feel the weight of the situation settling in. The HOA was powerful, and they had resources. The pressure was mounting, and it felt like the entire neighborhood was watching us, waiting to see how this would play out. Then, the final straw came. One afternoon, while I was at work, Emily called me in a panic. "You need to get home. The fence, someone's torn it down." My heart sank. I didn't need to ask who was behind it. I knew exactly who would want to destroy everything we had worked for. I rushed home, my mind racing with anger. When I arrived, the sight of the broken fence was worse than I had imagined. The posts had been ripped out, the wood shattered and thrown to the ground. The lake was exposed again, vulnerable. But that wasn't the worst part. I looked around and saw Ted standing by the broken fence, a grin on his face. Behind him were two of his friends, both holding tools. "Well," Ted said, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "I thought I'd make things easier for you. You know, since you couldn't seem to get it right." I felt my blood boil. The audacity, the nerve. I had given them the benefit of the doubt, but this was beyond disrespect. This was intentional destruction, and I wasn't going to stand for it. I marched over to Ted, my fists clenched at my sides. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Ted didn't even flinch. "Fixing your mistake," he said with a smug smile. "Consider this a warning." I stood there, stunned by what I had just seen. Ted and his friends had torn down my fence, my only defense against the HOA's overreach, and here they were, standing proudly in front of the wreckage they had caused. "Why?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. "What do you get out of this, Ted? Is it really worth destroying something just because you think you can?" Ted didn't seem to care. He crossed his arms and shrugged nonchalantly. "I told you, I'm just doing what the HOA wants. They're the ones who asked me to come out here." He glanced over his shoulder, where his friends stood, arms crossed, watching me with that same smug, condescending expression. "Consider this your final warning," Ted said, his tone hardening. "If you don't tear this fence down and open up the lake to the public, we're going to keep escalating this. You won't win." I was seeing red, but I knew I had to stay calm. Losing control now would only give him the satisfaction he wanted. My thoughts raced, but one thing was clear. I wasn't backing down. The HOA and Ted had crossed a line. This was more than just about property anymore. This was about principle. "You think you can just walk onto my property and destroy what's mine?" I asked, stepping closer to him. "Well, I have news for you. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Ted smirked. "We'll see about that." Without saying another word, I turned and walked back into the house, my mind racing. I knew the HOA was pulling out all the stops now. I had no choice but to escalate things even further. If Ted and the HOA thought they could push me around, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I immediately called Linda, my lawyer. I explained what had happened, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fury boiling inside me. "We've got them now," Linda said with confidence in her voice. "I'll make sure the HOA knows exactly what they're dealing with. They can't just send someone to destroy your property like that." It's time to take this to court. Linda was right. But this wasn't just about going to court anymore. This was about taking back control. It wasn't just a legal battle. It had become a fight for my rights. And I was ready to take it to the next level. That night, I stayed up late, drafting a statement for the court. I made sure to include every detail, the HOA's threats, Ted's role in the destruction, and the fact that they had no legal claim to the lake. I was going to make sure that everyone knew what had happened and that the HOA could not continue their bullying tactics. By the time Linda filed the paperwork the next day, the tension in the air had reached a breaking point. I could feel the eyes of the entire neighborhood on me, some with sympathy, some with judgment, but all of them were watching, and I didn't care. Then, just as things seemed to be escalating, I got an unexpected call. It was from Ted. "I'm giving you one last chance," Ted said, his voice eerily calm. "If you don't remove the fence by the end of the week, we'll have no choice but to call in the authorities. This is your final warning." I let out a bitter laugh. "You can call whoever you want, Ted. It won't change anything. The lake is mine, and I'm not going to let you or the HOA take it." I hung up before he could say another word. That's when I got the idea. I wasn't just going to sit back and wait for the court date to arrive. If Ted thought he could tear down my fence and get away with it, then it was time for me to send a message. I called a local construction crew that I had worked with before. They were experienced, efficient, and they didn't ask too many questions. Within a few hours, they arrived at my property. They were ready to help me build a new fence, one that was bigger, stronger, and impossible to ignore. "We're building something that will make sure this never happens again," I told the crew. "Make it big. Make it unmovable." As the crew worked, I could see people watching from their windows, whispers spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. The HOA couldn't ignore this. The next move had to be made by them, and they knew it. 2 days later, the new fence was up. It was massive, towering, and reinforced with steel. It made the old one look like a joke. The lake was completely enclosed, and there was no way anyone could come near it without noticing. The fence wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a message. Ted didn't take long to react. That afternoon, I saw his car pull up again, his familiar smug face in the driver's seat. This time, he wasn't alone. He had a whole crew with him, lawyers, the HOA board members, and even a few local officials. They got out of the car, looking like they were ready for war. I walked down the driveway to meet them, my jaw set and my fists clenched. "This is your doing, isn't it?" Ted said, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the new fence. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, waiting for them to make their move. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The next few moments were going to change everything. "I've had enough of this nonsense," I said. "This lake is mine. You have no claim over it. You can't just show up here, tear down my property, and expect me to roll over. If you want to fight, you've got one." Ted opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, I turned and motioned to the fence. "This is your warning. The next step is court. You bring your lawyers, I'll bring mine, and we'll see who the law stands behind." The silence that followed felt heavy. Ted seemed to weigh his options, but I could tell he wasn't ready to back down. But that was the moment I knew. No matter what came next, I had already won. The final day in court arrived. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. What had started as a simple fight to protect my property had now escalated into something much bigger. Ted and the HOA weren't going to back down, but neither was I. This wasn't just about the lake anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. The courtroom was filled with tension, the air thick with anticipation. I sat at the defendant's table, Linda beside me, my heart pounding. Ted and his group of lawyers sat across from us, trying to hide their smug expressions behind stacks of legal papers. The judge, an older man with a stern face, called the court to order. His eyes flicked between us all before he spoke. "We are here today to settle a matter regarding the ownership and use of the lake located on the defendant's property. The HOA claims that the lake should be considered public access, while the defendant argues that the property is private, as indicated by legal documents." I could feel all eyes on me as the tension in the room grew. This was the moment of truth. If I lost here, I could lose everything. My property, my sanctuary, the peace I had worked for. Ted's lawyer, a tall, serious-looking man, stood up first. Your Honor, we believe the lake is public property. We have received complaints from various neighbors about the restricted access, and it is our position that the fence built by the defendant is an illegal obstruction to the public. The lawyer spoke with confidence, presenting document after document, trying to back up the HOA's claim. It was all carefully calculated, but I could see the flaws in their argument. The lake was private, and no one had the right to claim otherwise. Then it was Linda's turn. She stood up, her posture straight, her voice calm but filled with determination. Your Honor, let me be clear. The lake in question has been private since the day the property was bought. We have official documents, deeds, tax records, and property surveys, proving that this land and its water belong to my client, Mr. Martin. The HOA's claim is baseless. She presented the paperwork, each piece of evidence knocking down the HOA's weak arguments. I watched as Ted's lawyer's face tightened with every piece of evidence Linda presented. They were running out of options. As Linda finished her argument, the judge didn't waste any time. He turned toward Ted's team, his voice cutting through the silence in the courtroom. Mr. Johnson, you've presented no evidence to suggest that this lake is public property. All the documentation here shows that it is private, and your client's attempt to interfere with that ownership is, quite frankly, without merit. Ted's face turned crimson with rage, but the judge was unmoved. The fence, while perhaps an inconvenience, is the defendant's right to install, as the lake is his property. The HOA has no legal claim here. This case is dismissed. A wave of relief washed over me. The judge had ruled in our favor. The lake was ours. I had one. Ted stood up, his jaw clenched in anger. His lawyers gathered their things in silence, their defeat clear. But I wasn't going to let them off easily. I stood up, facing Ted as he stormed out of the courtroom. You were wrong, I said, my voice steady but filled with satisfaction. You and the HOA can't just take whatever you want. This is my property, my lake, and I'm not going to let you, or anyone, take it from me. Ted didn't say a word. He just glared at me, but there was nothing he could do anymore. The court had spoken. The fight was over. After the court ruling, things settled down in the neighborhood. Ted and the HOA, thoroughly embarrassed, kept their distance. The lake was once again safe, and the fence remained up, stronger than ever. It was a constant reminder of the battle we had fought and won. Neighbors who had once sided with the HOA began to come around, apologizing for their silence during the conflict. Some even offered to help with the lake's maintenance, showing that they respected my decision. Emily and I spent more time by the water, knowing we had protected what was ours. In the end, the fight wasn't just about ownership or rules. It was about standing up for yourself, no matter how big the opposition. And in the end, I knew we had made the right call. The lake was ours, and nothing was going to change that. The sound of tires screeching on gravel shattered the evening calm, making my chest tighten. I glanced out the window just in time to see a sleek, black SUV turn into the long driveway leading to my lake cabin. I froze. Who would be driving this far out at this hour? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the last thing I wanted was some random visitor disturbing the peaceful retreat I had carefully built. I quickly shoved aside the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine and stepped out onto the porch to get a better look. The vehicle rolled to a stop, and the engine cut off. For a brief moment, everything fell into silence. Then, the door to the SUV swung open, and out stepped a woman who looked completely out of place. Her high heels clicked sharply against the stone path, her perfectly pressed blazer seeming absurd in the rustic, secluded setting. She was all sharp edges and disapproving glances, her eyes scanning the area as though she were an inspector at a museum. I didn't move. I stood there, watching, trying to make sense of why this woman, dressed as though she were attending a corporate meeting, had decided to show up uninvited at my quiet little cabin. With a stiff walk and an air of superiority, she made her way toward the steps, where I stood rooted to the spot. Her gaze briefly met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Excuse me," she said with a sharpness that made my stomach tighten. "Are you the owner of this property?" Her voice wasn't just curious. It had the kind of tone that suggested she had already made up her mind about who I was and why I was here. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. I wasn't about to be intimidated by some random woman who clearly had no business being on my land. Can I help you? She didn't answer right away, choosing instead to glance around at the cabin and the land stretching out behind it. I could tell she wasn't impressed. Her gaze hardened. "I'm Karen," she said, almost as if she expected me to recognize her name. "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association for the area." She didn't need to say more. I had heard enough of these HOA horror stories from friends and family. But the weirdest part was that she was standing there, on land that wasn't even part of the HOA jurisdiction. My cabin was nestled on the outskirts, outside the boundaries of any formal subdivision. There was no HOA here. She must have seen the confusion on my face because she quickly added, "I'm here about the noise. Your cabin is ruining the vacation experience for other guests around the lake. It's too disruptive." I blinked in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. My cabin was a secluded hideaway, far from any noisy tourist spots. I had come here specifically for the peace and quiet, and I made sure that no loud parties or disturbances ever took place. Ruining their vacation? I echoed. "Karen, this place is miles from any tourist spots. Who is even complaining?" She didn't hesitate. "Well, it's not just about the noise. It's the overall disruption. We've had complaints from other cabin owners. People are being disturbed by the sounds of your activities. I've been asked to speak with you personally." My mind raced, but I fought to stay calm. "What activities? I'm just here to relax. There's nothing here but the sounds of nature. What exactly is the issue?" Karen didn't seem to care for my confusion. Instead, her eyes narrowed as if she were dissecting every detail of my existence at this cabin. "You're ruining the serenity. We don't want any more disturbances out here, and frankly, it's about time someone put an end to this." I could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, and suddenly, it hit me. She wasn't just some concerned neighbor. She was here for one thing: control. The tension between us thickened, and I realized that this wasn't just a casual visit. Karen wasn't here to discuss noise or trivial complaints. It was clear she had a specific agenda. As she stood there, looking me over like I was some kind of nuisance she had to deal with, a wave of anger surged through me. How dare she come here uninvited and try to dictate how I should enjoy my time at my own cabin? My mind raced with questions. Why now, of all times? Why was she so concerned with my little corner of the world when there were miles of untouched land all around? She didn't seem to be in any rush, though. Karen continued surveying the surroundings, her eyes scanning the trees, the lake, and the modest cabin that had been my refuge for months. It was as if she were appraising it, figuring out how to manipulate the situation in her favor. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, calculating her next move. The unsettling feeling of being scrutinized only intensified, and I knew that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. After what seemed like an eternity, she turned back to me, her expression stiff and unreadable. She mentioned something about how the neighborhood had high standards for property upkeep, though I couldn't fathom what she meant. There was no neighborhood here, just a few scattered properties, each with its own private stretch of land. But to Karen, this entire area seemed to exist for her to control. It was becoming clearer that she saw herself as the gatekeeper of all things related to the lake, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially me, live freely without her approval. I had never imagined that my retreat, my safe space, could become the center of someone else's warped sense of order. As she spoke, her words began to sound more like orders than suggestions, and I could feel my frustration growing. How could she possibly believe she had any say in how I managed my own property? There were no rules here other than the ones I had set for myself. Yet, Karen was standing before me, acting as if her self-appointed authority over the area gave her the right to tell me what I could and couldn't do on my own land. The more she talked, the clearer it became that she wasn't interested in solutions. She was only interested in control. Her mention of the vacation experience made my blood boil. The lake had always been peaceful, a place for people to find solace. But now, according to Karen, I was disturbing the peace. The absurdity of it all started to sink in. What did she mean by disturbing the peace? I had come here to escape the chaos of everyday life, and she was now accusing me of being the source of some imaginary problem. The anger that had been simmering inside me finally boiled over, but I knew I needed to keep my cool. I reminded myself that she was out of place here, and she wasn't going to bully me into submission. I wasn't part of her so-called community, and there was no way I was going to let her invade my life like this. But despite all my rational thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't going to back down easily. The more I tried to reason with her, the more determined she seemed to become. It was as though her mind was already made up, and she believed her actions were justified, no matter how ridiculous they seemed. Her next move came without warning. She pulled out a small piece of paper, which appeared to be a formal complaint of some sort. With a casual flick of her wrist, she handed it to me. The document looked official, with a logo I didn't recognize at the top, and it was filled with bureaucratic language about noise disturbances and property violations. I didn't need to read it to know it was a thinly veiled threat, an attempt to push me into submission. The very idea that she had come here to try and make me feel guilty for enjoying the quiet, peaceful life I had chosen was almost laughable. Almost. Because as much as I hated to admit it, I knew Karen wasn't just going to walk away with a simple no. She had made it clear that she was determined to make me comply, and now, the stakes were higher than I had anticipated. The feeling of dread gnawed at me as she stood there, waiting for my response. It was obvious that this was only the beginning of what would likely become a long, drawn-out battle. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't going to let this woman take control of my life, but at the same time, I knew that if I let the situation escalate, it would only get worse. I looked at the paper in my hand, barely skimming its contents. It didn't matter. It was just more of Karen's attempt to impose her rules on something that wasn't hers to control. I glanced up at her, trying to mask my frustration, but I could tell she wasn't going to leave easily. This wasn't just about the cabin or the so-called disturbances. It was about power. She had some twisted notion that she was the authority here, that she could dictate the rules of a place that was far beyond her reach. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt like she wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to break me. As she stood there, smugly watching me, I realized that she was playing a game I had no intention of participating in. I had come to this place to escape the noise of the world, to find peace and solitude, not to get tangled in someone else's power struggle. Karen wasn't interested in being a neighbor. She didn't care about finding a resolution. She wanted control. The more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. My cabin wasn't just some vacation property. It was my home, my refuge, and it was far removed from the reach of her so-called HOA. She had no legal claim to anything here, and yet she acted as though she did. Karen's presence, the looming threat of her incessant demands, made me feel as though the calm I had worked so hard to cultivate was slipping through my fingers. My chest tightened as I realized that this woman wasn't going to back down, not without a fight. But I had something she didn't, a sense of ownership over my land, a right to protect my privacy and my peace. If I gave her an inch, she would take a mile, and before long, she'd be dictating every aspect of my life. I wasn't about to let that happen. As the sun continued to sink lower in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the cabin, the weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just an inconvenient visit. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that could easily spiral out of control. I had dealt with difficult people before, but this felt different. Karen's insistence on her power over this land was unlike anything I had experienced. She wasn't just a neighbor who had a problem. She was a force to be reckoned with, and I knew that if I didn't stand my ground, I'd be giving up everything I had worked for. The night air began to grow colder, and I watched as Karen fiddled with the papers in her hands, clearly expecting me to fold, to give in to her demands. But I wasn't going to. No matter how many times she tried to tell me that I was the problem, that I was causing some disruption in her perfect little world, I knew the truth. I wasn't the one causing problems, she was. Her attempt to impose her will on me was an invasion, and I wasn't about to let it slide. But as I stood there, silently weighing my options, I realized something else. Karen wasn't working alone. She had already started this battle, but I was willing to bet that she had others who would back her up. The HOA, the so-called neighborhood, she kept referring to wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was a tool, one that she was using to try and manipulate me into submission. I could already picture the letters, the phone calls, and the constant pressure she would apply until I eventually gave in. I had to be ready for that. This wasn't going to end with a single conversation. It was just the first of many. I knew I needed a plan. I wasn't about to give up my cabin without a fight, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I'd have to start gathering information, talking to other people in the area, and most importantly, I had to protect myself legally. Karen might think she had the upper hand, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next few days felt like a blur of frustration and confusion. I tried to carry on with my daily routine, enjoying the quiet of the cabin, but Karen's shadow loomed over me. It became clear that she wasn't going to let this go easily. The more I thought about the situation, the more I realized just how far she might be willing to go to impose her will. I knew that I couldn't afford to be passive in this fight. I had to take action, and I had to do it quickly. The first step was to understand exactly what Karen could, or more importantly, couldn't do. I decided to visit the local county office to get a clearer picture of the laws and regulations surrounding the area. My cabin was technically outside of any HOA jurisdiction, but I needed to know for sure that Karen's threats were empty. I walked into the small, nondescript building that housed the county's zoning office, feeling a slight sense of urgency creeping up my spine. The clerk behind the desk greeted me with a friendly smile, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes as I explained my situation. She raised an eyebrow when I mentioned Karen and the HOA. "That doesn't sound right," she said, flipping through her files. "I'm not seeing any official documentation regarding any HOA for that area. The land you're on is private, and there shouldn't be any restrictions." That news was a small but welcome relief. I had suspected as much, but hearing it from someone who knew the local rules gave me a sense of assurance. Karen's HOA, as far as the county records were concerned, had no legitimate claim over my property. That was one battle won, but I knew the war wasn't over. I had to prepare for the next move Karen might make, and I wasn't about to let her take me by surprise. With this knowledge in hand, I began to make a list of actions I could take. The first was obvious. I needed to make sure Karen knew that I was prepared to fight back if necessary. I wasn't going to let her believe that her presence alone could force me out. So, I made a few calls to a lawyer, someone who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. If Karen wanted to escalate things further, I wanted to be ready. It didn't take long for me to find a lawyer who seemed eager to take on the case. He promised to look over the documents Karen had given me and to help me prepare for anything she might try in the future. In the meantime, I started reaching out to neighbors. While most of the people around the lake kept to themselves, I knew there had to be others who were just as frustrated with Karen's meddling as I was. I knocked on a few doors and spoke to a couple of people who had been living there for years. To my surprise, many of them shared similar stories of Karen's overbearing attitude, her attempts to control everything from landscaping to personal freedoms. It turned out that Karen wasn't just trying to pick a fight with me. She had a history of trying to push people around in the neighborhood, and she was known for going to extreme lengths to get what she wanted. One of the neighbors, a woman named Marie, told me that Karen had tried to pressure her into allowing community access to her property several years ago. Marie had stood her ground, but it had taken months of back and forth before Karen backed off. The more I heard, the more I realized how manipulative and persistent Karen could be. It was unsettling to think that she had the power to influence others in the area, but I was beginning to understand the pattern of her behavior. Armed with this new information, I started to plan my next move. I wasn't going to wait for Karen to come knocking again. I knew that if I gave her the opportunity, she would continue to push, and I'd be caught off guard. This wasn't just about the cabin. It was about protecting my right to live freely without someone like Karen trying to control every aspect of my life. I made sure to install security cameras around the perimeter of my cabin. I also added more lighting around the driveway and the gate. It wasn't just about preventing Karen from showing up unannounced. It was about creating a sense of security for myself. If she tried to step foot on my land again, I wanted to make sure I had evidence to back up any claims of harassment or trespassing. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't going to be over anytime soon. Karen wasn't someone who took no for an answer, and I had no illusions about what she might do next. But I wasn't going to be intimidated. This was my land, and I was going to fight for it. If Karen thought she could push me around just because she didn't like the way I was living, she had another thing coming that a week passed, and I thought perhaps Karen had backed off, realizing her attempts to intimidate me were futile. But that sense of peace didn't last long. One afternoon, as I was on the porch reading a book, I noticed a shadow moving near the edge of the property. My instincts kicked in, and I stood up, heart racing. Slowly, I made my way to the window, peering through the blinds. There she was, Karen, walking along the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, as if she had every right to be there. My blood ran cold. She wasn't just visiting this time. She was surveying the area, taking notes, and, from what I could see, preparing for something bigger. It was clear she hadn't given up, and now, she was making her move. I took a moment to steady my breathing, trying not to let my anger get the best of me. It seemed like Karen wasn't going to back off easily, and I knew that if I didn't confront her now, things were only going to escalate. I grabbed my phone, taking a quick picture of her walking around my property. It wasn't much, but it was proof that she had once again crossed the line. I couldn't help but wonder how far she was willing to go. Was she really trying to impose some sort of authority over my cabin? If so, I had to make it clear that I wasn't going to let her take control. Stepping outside, I walked towards the edge of the porch, hoping she'd notice me and leave. But she didn't. Karen continued to jot down her notes, oblivious to my presence, as if she were some sort of inspector. Her arrogance was maddening, but it only fueled my resolve. I wasn't about to let her walk all over me. As I approached her, I could hear the crunch of the gravel beneath my boots, and when I was close enough, I called out to her, my voice firm but controlled. She turned, a look of surprise quickly replaced by that smug smile I had come to loathe. Without acknowledging her presence, I told her flatly that she needed to leave. Her expression faltered, but only for a moment. She gave a dismissive wave as if I were an inconvenience in her day. She started to speak, but I didn't let her finish. I told her once again that this was private property, and she had no business being here. Karen's response was exactly what I expected. A feigned apology and an attempt to justify her actions. She claimed that her neighbors were still complaining about the noise, about the so-called disturbance I was causing. I had heard enough. This was becoming a game to her, one where she believed that by repeating her lies often enough, she could convince me to back down. But I wasn't buying it. I didn't waste any more time trying to reason with her. Instead, I pulled out my phone and began recording. Karen's eyes narrowed as she saw what I was doing. Her smug demeanor shifted to irritation. But I didn't care. I was done with this back and forth. I wasn't going to let her pull any more of these stunts without documenting it. She couldn't just show up and dictate how I lived, and if she tried, I was going to make sure I had everything on record. The more I recorded, the more agitated she became. I could see her hand twitching toward her phone, perhaps considering making some call, some threat to escalate things. But I was ready for that too. The more I stood my ground, the more Karen seemed to retreat inwardly, trying to hold on to some semblance of control, but she was losing her grip. The standoff lasted only a few more minutes before she turned abruptly and began walking back to her SUV. I kept the camera rolling, just in case she had any parting words, but she didn't. As she climbed into her vehicle, her face was twisted in frustration. She slammed the door and sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust in her wake. I stood there for a moment, watching her leave, but I didn't feel relief. No, this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't going to walk away that easily, not with her ego bruised. I knew I had to be prepared for whatever she had planned next. She was relentless, and now, I had to outlast her. I went back inside, the weight of the situation settling in. This wasn't just about a cabin or some noise complaints. This was about control. Karen wanted to be the one calling the shots, and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. But I wasn't going to let her. I had fought too hard to find peace at this lake, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. The battle had just begun, but I was ready. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty and tension. I stayed on high alert, my eyes constantly scanning the perimeter of the property, waiting for the next sign that Karen was coming back. I knew she wasn't done yet. Her last visit was far from a peaceful retreat. and it didn't take a genius to figure out that her persistence wasn't going to fade quietly. The anxiety of not knowing what she might do next hung in the air like a storm cloud, but I refused to let it control me. Every time I stepped outside, I felt the eyes of the world, or at least of Karen, on me. It was unsettling, but it also steeled my resolve. This was my land, and I wasn't going to back down. In the days that followed, I doubled down on my preparations. I wasn't just waiting for her to show up again. I was taking steps to ensure that I would be ready if she did. I installed more cameras around the cabin and set up motion sensors that would alert me the second anyone crossed onto my property. If Karen, or anyone associated with her, tried to step foot on my land again, I was going to have evidence. I wasn't going to let her manipulate or intimidate me any longer. As I spent hours securing the property, I felt a growing sense of control return to my life. For the first time since this nightmare started, I realized that I had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let go of it. Days turned into weeks, and Karen's visits became more sporadic, but that didn't mean she had given up. I continued to receive letters from her, each one more ridiculous than the last. They were filled with empty threats, demanding that I remove structures on my property that had been there for years without incident. She even had the audacity to claim that I was violating community standards, a laughable notion when the closest neighbor was miles away. But I refused to be intimidated by her petty tactics. Each letter was filed away, a reminder of her relentless attempts to force me into submission. It didn't matter how many papers she sent or how many threats she made. She had no authority over me, and that truth was something I clung to tightly. But then, one evening, I received a letter unlike any of the others. This one wasn't just a warning or a request for compliance. It was an official-looking document, stamped with a seal I didn't recognize. As I read the words on the page, a sense of dread washed over me. Karen had gone a step further. She had enlisted the help of an attorney, and this letter was a formal demand for me to cease any activities on my property that she deemed disruptive to the area. The letter claimed that if I failed to comply, she would take legal action. The audacity of it hit me like a punch to the gut. Not only was she trying to impose her will on my life, but now she was attempting to use the legal system to back up her baseless demands. It was clear that she wasn't just playing games anymore. This was a full-blown attack, and she was pulling out all the stops. I didn't waste time dwelling on the letter. Instead, I called the attorney I had been in contact with, outlining the new developments. He was quick to reassure me that this wasn't anything to be concerned about. He had dealt with people like Karen before, and he assured me that her claims had no legal standing. But the thought of her trying to use the courts against me made my blood boil. I wasn't going to let her drag me into some drawn-out legal battle. I had already wasted enough time and energy dealing with her antics. It was time to put an end to it once and for all. The next day, I decided to take a different approach. I knew that Karen's power came from her belief that she could wear people down, make them feel as though they had no choice but to comply with her will. But I wasn't like the others. I wasn't going to give in to her demands. I reached out to the other cabin owners in the area, hoping to find people who were just as fed up with Karen's behavior as I was. To my surprise, several of them responded, some offering their support, while others shared stories of their own encounters with her. It was clear that Karen had been making waves in the neighborhood for years, and now, I had the backing of the very people who had been dealing with her long before I showed up. Armed with this newfound support, I began to make plans for the next phase of my defense. If Karen wanted to escalate things, then I would be ready. I wasn't going to let her turn my dream of a peaceful retreat into some legal nightmare. The lake, the cabin, everything I had worked so hard to create was mine, and I would do whatever it took to protect it. As I prepared for the battle ahead, a sense of clarity washed over me. Karen may have thought she could intimidate me, but what she didn't realize was that she had underestimated my resolve. I wasn't just fighting for my property. I was fighting for my right to live without someone else's constant interference. And no matter what she threw my way, I was ready to stand my ground. The following week, I gathered all my resources, documents, emails, and evidence that Karen's attempts to harass me were baseless. I meticulously prepared a case, one that would be impossible to dismiss. I knew this wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about making sure that Karen couldn't keep pushing people around and abusing her self-proclaimed authority. She had built her own little world, where everyone bowed to her so-called HOA rules, but I wasn't going to let her expand that bubble into my life. As much as I wanted to ignore her, I realized that letting her continue unchecked would only embolden her. I hired a lawyer to take on the case, a tough, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in property disputes. Together, we combed through every letter, every threat, every interaction I had with Karen. The more we went through, the clearer it became that Karen had no real legal grounds to stand on. In fact, she had been using the power of her supposed position to manipulate others into complying with her demands, and now she had tried to take it to the next level with legal threats. My lawyer assured me that, given the private nature of my property and the complete absence of any legitimate HOA regulations, Karen had no case. But I wasn't about to take that risk. I didn't want to let Karen have the satisfaction of seeing me back down, but I also didn't want to let this escalate into something bigger than it had to be. I started documenting everything, every letter, every phone call, every visit she made to my property. If she wanted to make a legal battle out of this, then I was prepared to fight back, and I wasn't going to let her get away with her petty threats. The idea of being constantly on edge, waiting for her to show up again, made me feel trapped. I had chosen this cabin to escape the stress of the world, but now, I felt like I couldn't fully relax until this situation was resolved. The weight of her presence was unbearable, and I knew that the longer this dragged on, the more it would chip away at the peace I had found here. I reached out to some of the other cabin owners who had expressed their support for me, and we started discussing how we could collectively deal with Karen. I was relieved to learn that I wasn't alone in my frustrations. Several of them had been pushed around by Karen before, and they were just as tired of her antics. Together, we realized that the best way to handle Karen was to show her that she couldn't isolate us one by one. We needed to stand united, to make it clear that no one was going to tolerate her behavior anymore. The plan we developed was simple. We would gather evidence of Karen's repeated oversteps and share it among ourselves, documenting everything she had tried to enforce on our properties. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone who had been subjected to her oppressive behavior. If we could show a pattern of harassment, we could make sure that she couldn't get away with it again. Each of us began to monitor our properties more closely, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. It wasn't long before another neighbor, who had been dealing with Karen for years, caught her trying to enter their property without permission. They managed to get photos and videos, which we added to the growing pile of evidence. We were building a solid case, and it felt empowering to know that I wasn't fighting this battle alone. The more I saw others getting involved, the more determined I became. Karen had underestimated the unity of the people she had tried to control. She thought she could bully us into submission, but we weren't backing down. I knew that things were going to get more complicated, but I felt confident that if we stood together, we could make sure Karen's power trip came to an end once and for all. We weren't just fighting for our properties. We were fighting for our dignity, for our right to live in peace without someone else trying to dictate our lives. Karen had crossed a line, and now it was time to make sure she learned that no one, no matter how entitled they felt, could get away with it. As the weeks passed, the tension only grew. Karen, seemingly undeterred by my legal preparations and the collective strength of the neighbors, began to escalate her tactics. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. She was trying to control everything around her. Every phone call, every letter she sent became more desperate, more aggressive, as if she thought that somehow if she applied enough pressure, I would cave. But with each new threat, I only felt more certain in my resolve. I knew I couldn't give in. I couldn't let her continue to disrupt the peace I had worked so hard to build. The situation came to a head one evening when I noticed a vehicle pull into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I had been expecting something, another visit from Karen, no doubt, but the timing felt ominous. It was late, too late for anyone other than Karen or her hired goons to be around. I quietly moved toward the window, peering out to see who it was. Sure enough, I saw the familiar black SUV parked near the edge of the property. My heart sank. It was her again. This time, though, I was ready. I had long ago decided that the next time Karen made an attempt to interfere with my life, I wouldn't stand for it. I had set up a small security system in the cabin, cameras positioned around the property to capture everything. I wasn't going to let her waltz onto my land again without documenting it. I moved quietly through the house, grabbing my phone and activating the camera app. I made sure the footage was running, then headed for the door, steeling myself for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. When I stepped outside, Karen was standing on the porch, clipboard in hand. She looked as confident as ever, as if she had the right to be there. I could see the familiar smug expression on her face as she surveyed the cabin, no doubt already formulating her next demand. She didn't even flinch when she saw me approaching. This time, she wasn't here to talk about noise or complaints. This time, she had a new game plan. I could see it in the way she stood, her posture rigid, ready for battle. Without wasting any time, she launched into her usual spiel about how the property was disrupting the tranquility of the area, how my activities were causing problems. But this time, her words carried a more sinister edge. She wasn't simply asking me to comply. She was threatening legal action, claiming that if I didn't comply with her so-called HOA rules, she would have no choice but to take things to the next level. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of menace that made my blood boil. She had come to take control, and now she was ready to fight for it. But I wasn't intimidated. I stood my ground, listening to her threats without flinching. I was tired of her trying to manipulate the situation. I wasn't going to let her dictate what I did with my property. The more she talked, the more certain I became that she didn't understand who she was dealing with. Karen might have thought she could push me around, but this time, I was prepared. As she rattled off her demands, I silently moved to the side, ensuring the camera was capturing everything. Her tone was growing more insistent, her frustration evident as she realized I wasn't responding in the way she had hoped. She wanted me to be scared. She wanted me to back down, but I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. The more she tried to manipulate the situation, the more my determination solidified. I knew that I had the law on my side, and I wasn't about to let Karen's delusions of control tear apart the life I had worked so hard to build. She could feel the shift, I could tell. The longer she stood there, the more desperate her words became. She knew, deep down, that she wasn't going to get away with it this time. The thought that she could come into my life and disrupt it, just because she felt entitled, was appalling, and she was starting to realize that I wasn't the type of person to roll over and let her win. But instead of backing off, she dug in her heels, like a petulant child who hadn't gotten their way. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't going to leave until she got something from me, anything that could be spun into a victory in her warped little game. The problem was, I wasn't playing by her rules. The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was only minutes. Karen's words became increasingly frantic, her sense of control slipping away as she realized that I wasn't going to give her anything. She had thought that a few threats and her self-appointed authority would be enough to bend me to her will, but it was clear that I wasn't the kind of person who would bow to her pressure. As I stood there, calmly listening to her repeated demands and hollow threats, I began to feel a strange sense of empowerment. This wasn't just a battle over my cabin. This was about something much bigger. It was about refusing to let someone with no real power dictate how I lived my life. I could see her growing more agitated, but I refused to let her provoke me. The more she tried to twist the situation in her favor, the more it became apparent that her grip on the situation was slipping. She wasn't just trying to control the property. She was trying to control me. And that, I realized, was something I couldn't let happen. As much as I wanted to yell, to finally stand up and tell her off, I knew it wouldn't help. The more composed I remained, the more rattled she became. The contrast between her angry, flustered demeanor and my calm, collected stance was striking. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of tension, Karen turned, her face flushed with frustration. She muttered something under her breath and stormed off toward her SUV, slamming the door behind her. For a brief moment, I thought she might leave for good, but something told me this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to walk away quietly. As she drove off, her tires kicking up gravel in her wake, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. I had won this round, but I knew Karen wasn't the kind of person to back down easily. This was only the beginning. I retreated back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. I wasn't sure what her next move would be, but I was ready for it. I had spent enough time preparing for this moment, and I wasn't going to let her interfere with my life any longer. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how far she was willing to go to have control. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew that I had to stop her. Karen was a bully, plain and simple, and it was up to me to put an end to her reign of manipulation. The next few days were a blur of planning and strategizing. I knew I had to be ready for whatever Karen would throw at me next. I made sure my lawyer was on standby, prepared to act quickly if necessary. The security system around the cabin was upgraded, with new cameras and motion sensors ensuring that I would have a clear record of anything that happened. The last thing I wanted was for Karen to show up unannounced and try to pull some stunt that would catch me off guard. I knew that she would try to find some other way to pressure me, and I wasn't going to let that happen. At the same time, I reached out to the other cabin owners who had rallied behind me. We shared our experiences, each of us detailing the ways in which Karen had tried to control our lives. There was a sense of solidarity among us, and I felt a renewed sense of determination. Karen might have thought she was invincible, but she had underestimated the strength of those she had tried to control. Together, we were stronger, and together, we were going to make sure that she never had the chance to bully anyone again. As the days went by, I began to feel the weight of the situation lift. It wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. Karen had tried to manipulate and intimidate me, but I wasn't going to let her win. I wasn't going to let her take control of my life. She had underestimated the power of people who refused to be controlled, and I knew that, in the end, that was the greatest weapon I had. No matter what Karen tried next, I was ready. Weeks passed, and Karen's presence lingered like a dark cloud on the horizon, but she didn't return to the cabin. The letters stopped, and her visits became fewer, more sporadic. It was clear she had taken a step back, but I knew better than to believe this was the end. Karen was a persistent force, and I had no doubt that she would be back in one form or another. Still, there was a sense of quiet for the first time in months. I allowed myself a brief moment of respite, the peacefulness of the lake once again taking center stage in my life. The sound of the water lapping against the shore, the rustle of the trees in the wind. These were the things I had come here for, and for a while, it seemed as if I could finally enjoy them in peace. But that peace was short-lived. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the fading warmth of the sun when the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel reached my ears. My heart skipped a beat, and instinctively, I stood up, peering over the railing. A familiar black SUV rolled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the trees. Karen had returned, and this time, I was prepared. I wasn't going to let her drag me into another drawn-out confrontation. I had learned enough about her persistence to know that she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted, but I was no longer intimidated. I calmly made my way inside, making sure the cameras were active and capturing the moment. I wasn't going to let her step foot on my property without a record of it this time. With every second that passed, the pressure built. I could feel the tension in the air, but I refused to let it overwhelm me. As Karen's SUV came to a stop, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The situation had been building for months, but now I could see it clearly. This wasn't just about my cabin. It wasn't about the noise complaints or the so-called HOA regulations. This was about Karen trying to impose control, trying to break me down with her constant meddling. And this time, I wasn't going to let her. She stepped out of the vehicle, looking as confident as ever, clipboard in hand. Her eyes scanned the property, her posture rigid, as if she had the right to be there. I could tell she wasn't expecting any resistance, but that was exactly what she was going to get. I stood on the porch, watching her for a moment, gathering my thoughts before making my move. I was done playing her game. I wasn't going to argue or try to reason with her anymore. The time for that was over. This was a battle that needed to end, and it was up to me to end it. I walked toward her, my steps deliberate, the quiet crunch of gravel underfoot signaling that I wasn't backing down. She turned to face me, her smile faltering slightly when she saw the determination in my eyes. This time, there would be no empty threats or power plays. Karen could try to intimidate me all she wanted, but she wasn't going to win this time. As I approached, I could see her stiffen, her composure cracking under the weight of the situation. I wasn't angry. I was calm, resolute and ready to stand my ground. She started to speak, as I had expected, launching into her usual complaints, but I cut her off before she could finish. I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses or justifications. She wasn't going to bully me into submission anymore. I calmly stated that I had done everything necessary to protect my property and my peace. Her so-called HOA had no legal standing, and there was no longer any room for negotiation. If she continued to try and impose her will on me, I would take legal action. Her expression faltered, and I could see the realization dawning on her. This was not going to go the way she had planned. Karen tried to argue, her words becoming more frantic, but I wasn't listening anymore. I had already made up my mind. I had all the evidence I needed to show that she was in the wrong, and I was prepared to use it. The calmness of my voice, the unwavering certainty in my words, seemed to unsettle her. She was used to getting her way, used to controlling people through fear and intimidation, but I wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was on my side, and that was more than enough to drive her back. Finally, with a huff of frustration, Karen turned and marched back to her SUV. She didn't look at me again, her head held high in a feigned show of defiance. As she drove away, I stood on the porch, watching her retreat. This wasn't over, but I had won this battle, and as the dust settled and the silence returned, I realized that I had taken back control. Karen might try to come back, but she had learned a valuable lesson. There was only so much she could push before she hit a wall. And this time, I wasn't going anywhere. As the weeks went by, Karen's visits became fewer, and the relentless pressure I had felt for so long began to fade. The sense of tension that had once clouded every moment of my life at the cabin started to lift, like the morning fog giving way to sunlight. It was as if, after all the struggle, I had finally managed to carve out a space for peace once again. Karen had tested me, pushed every boundary, and tried to impose her will on me. But in the end, she had underestimated the one thing that had kept me standing strong: my resolve. I had fought for my right to enjoy this cabin, my sanctuary, and I had won. I spent more time outdoors, feeling the cool breeze and the warmth of the sun without the constant worry that someone was watching or planning their next move. The lake shimmered in the distance, the same peaceful view I had come to love, and for the first time in months, I felt like I truly belonged here again. I didn't have to look over my shoulder, didn't have to worry about the next letter or the next confrontation. I had set boundaries, I had protected my land, and most importantly, I had protected my peace. Karen's name gradually faded from my thoughts, a distant echo of the chaos she had tried to stir. I knew she wouldn't give up entirely, but whatever she tried next, I was ready. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to be on edge. The battle had been long, but it had taught me more than I had expected. I had learned that no one could take what was mine, not without a fight. As the days turned into weeks and the seasons shifted, I found myself fully reclaiming the life I had come here to build. The peace I had sought was no longer an illusion but a reality. The cabin, the lake, the land, they were mine, and nothing or no one could change that. When I looked out over the water now, it wasn't with a sense of dread or fear, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had stood my ground, that I had protected the space I had worked so hard to create. In the end, I had won. Not just over Karen, but over the forces that had threatened my peace. I had found the strength to protect what mattered most, and that made every moment of silence all the sweeter as the months passed. Life at the cabin settled into a new rhythm, one that felt more secure, more grounded. I spent my days with the lake as my constant companion, watching the seasons change as if they had always been there, waiting for me to fully embrace the tranquility they offered. The memories of Karen's harassment began to blur, replaced by the sound of rustling leaves and the soft hum of nature. It was as though the lake, the land, had quietly claimed me back, and in turn, I had learned to trust it again. I found solace in the simple things: long walks along the water's edge, early mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, and evenings where the sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and orange. My thoughts no longer dwelled on the chaos Karen had tried to create. Instead, they drifted to plans for the future, to the projects I had been putting off. and to the possibility of finally making the cabin exactly what I had always dreamed. The cabin had always been a work in progress, a project I had poured my heart into. But now, it was more than just a building. It was home, a place where I could breathe freely without the fear of someone intruding on my life. Occasionally, I would hear about Karen from other cabin owners in the area. Some had moved away, tired of the constant pressure she had put on them. Others had learned to coexist with her, but none of them had forgotten what she was capable of. But for me, hearing her name no longer stirred the anger or anxiety it once had. She had tried to take something from me, tried to break my spirit, but in the end, she had only strengthened my resolve. I knew that if she ever decided to return, I would be ready, but for now, I felt a quiet sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. There was a satisfaction in knowing that, despite her best efforts, I had kept my sense of ownership over the cabin, over the land. It was mine, not because I had fought tooth and nail for it, but because I had refused to let anyone dictate my life. Karen had underestimated me. She had thought she could control me, but in the end, she was just a fleeting shadow, a brief disruption in the stillness that had always belonged to me. As I watched the sunset one evening, with the lake reflecting the golden hues of the sky, I realized that the fight had been worth it. I had protected what mattered, and now I could rest easy.